Good evening. Welcome to NoVA UX. Tonight, we welcome user experience designer Grace Kim, who will be sharing her learnings from breaking down her analysis of over 50 friction-causing user experiences, framing her analysis in design fundamentals. Welcome, Grace. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jim, for that introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Grace, and I am a user experience designer based in Austin, Texas. And I made the transition into UX from marketing a couple years ago after personally experiencing frustrations with the products that I was using both personally and professionally. And I think that those frustrations and experiences that I've had really helped to characterize me as a designer who is an advocate for design fundamentals, especially when creating productive user experiences. So this body of work, alongside a collection of writings I've done on this topic and published on my website and on Twitter and on LinkedIn, they're really a culmination of my advocacy for design fundamentals. So for this presentation, I'd like to share the work I've done over the past 7 months of deciding to take the everyday interface frictions that I was coming across as a user and examining these frictions through the lens of design fundamentals in order to better understand why exactly I was experiencing these frictions and which mechanisms were responsible for them. So for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to use the term friction or user interface friction to mean any conflict that is experienced by a user when engaging with an interface. And user interface frictions can be experienced in a variety of ways. From the frictions that I encountered as a user, I identified and categorized them as either belonging to emotional, continuity, efficiency, or cognitive friction. But regardless of the category of friction, all interface frictions diminish user experience. Design fundamentals, which are qualities and principles and heuristics, are crucial in that they are critical towards the development of intuitive and productive user experiences, that they really lend for a human-centric experience for users. They also play a role in decision-making. They help to illuminate which decisions need to be made over others. They also lend a hand in precision. They help you to precisely determine which elements are critical to an experience. In the absence of design fundamentals, conflict or friction can happen. So the first category of friction that I'll be discussing is emotional friction. And for this talk, emotional friction is described as any experience that produces negative feelings. So these feelings can range from feelings like anxiety and frustration and confusion to more severe feelings like panic and impatience and even anger. And emotional friction occurs as a reaction to an unexpected experience with an interface or when expectations for a system are broken. I first experienced an example of emotional friction that I encountered is when I was playing video games on my Samsung TV. So several hours into playing, a notice appeared on the screen saying that the TV would shut off in 60 seconds unless I disabled this action. So the appearance of this notice, that created feelings of panic for me because I was presently in the middle of fighting enemies in a very high-risk location, as you can see by the fire on the screen. It also created feelings of disorientation because that meant I had to very suddenly switch gears from accomplishing my agenda in the game to very suddenly and frantically searching the room for a remote that I had completely forgotten about. And all the while, I'm concerned that my character in the game is losing health because the appearance of this notice it actually hasn't paused the game. It's just floating on top of an active game. So the game is still going on behind it. And when I finally do manage to find the remote and then disable this auto shut off, the result is emotional friction, because I was subjected to an anxiety-inducing experience that left me feeling honestly quite angry and betrayed by the system. This instance of emotional friction that I experienced can be considered through the design heuristic support an internal locus of control. And this heuristic reflects the fact that the desire for control is actually very deeply ingrained in our psyches. Considered from the perspective of evolution, the greater the control that we had over our environment, the greater the chances of survival that we had as a species. Understanding that we had the ability to change our situation through our actions and be essentially successful change agents established a very fundamental and honestly deeply innate desire for control that's shared by all of us. So today, while this inclination for control lives in the unconscious mind, it still remains responsible for several conscious aspects of our lives, like being motivated by autonomy and the freedom to do things on our own when we want to and how we want to. When our internal loci of control and sense of autonomy are at risk, it can create feelings of anxiety and powerlessness and even neuroticism. And those feelings are the direct result of our unconscious desire for control being threatened. Because the unconscious part of our brain equates control with safety, we are then comforted when we're in control. When we're in control, the likelihood of danger is then minimized and the chances of our survival increases. Given the design heuristics support an internal locus of control for users, users should then feel in control of the system and free to make reasonable decisions. Coming back to the experience with Samsung TV, the design heuristics support an internal locus of control wasn't leveraged. And we see this in how the auto shut off was imposed on me and made me feel powerless as a person. And so I was left with an anxiety-inducing experience. Another instance of emotional friction I experienced is when I was signing in on Twitter. And after repeatedly entering in my login information and still being stuck on the sign-in screen, I began feeling confused, impatient, and anxious that maybe it was Twitter's own system that was at fault here. But it was only when I noticed that there was a blue alert at the bottom of the screen that I realized that it was a typo on my part. And this realization made me feel frustrated that this notice wasn't more obvious in the first place. And ultimately, I felt annoyed that this very minor element was such a source of delay for me as a user. The emotional friction that I experienced with Twitter can be examined through the design heuristic help users recognize, diagnose, and recover from errors. And a crucial factor in helping users recognize and diagnose errors successfully is by placing error notices and alerts in their locus of attention. With Twitter, because I had just entered in my email and then clicked the next button, and now I'm waiting for the home feed to load, my locus of attention is now centered in the middle of the screen. Because the error notice is located outside of this locus of attention, then it isn't immediately obvious to me as a user and contributes to the emotional friction and anxiety I feel of having to problem solve on my own. Of course, in reality, the locus of attention is much more concentrated. Additionally, the fact that the error notice was in blue is also partly responsible for why I failed to recognize it. While we don't have a universal consensus for the meaning of colors, on the whole, our collective mental model understands the color red to mean stop or danger, and the color green to mean go or yes, which is why it's become convention to use the color red to communicate that an error has been made. But a blue notice, like on Twitter, that doesn't communicate to me that an error has been made, nor does it shift the locus of attention like the shock of a red notice. Placing error notices and alerts in the user's loci of attention in appropriate colors allows users to then immediately recognize mistakes when they happen and then empower them to take the appropriate actions necessary to correct them, instead of experiencing the frustration and anxiety I did of problem solving on their own. Anxiety affects the ability to problem solve because being in a state of fight or flight decreases cognitive capacity. And when cognitive capacity is decreased, our performance ends up suffering because it then takes longer for us to process information that's coming in and effectively problem solve from there. And all of this creates a very negative experience for the user. Another form of friction that I experienced is continuity friction. And for this talk, continuity friction is experienced when there is a break in the user's workflow. And that break can result from a task taking longer than expected to complete, or when attention drifts from the original task. One example of continuity friction that I encountered is when I was trying to display battery percentage on the updated macOS Monterey. In the previous macOS Catalina, doing that only took 2 clicks. That meant I had to click the battery icon in the menu bar and then click the following show percentage. To display the battery percentage in macOS Monterey, I had to navigate through several screens. And what that looked like was, like in the previous OS, I clicked the battery icon expecting to see show percentage. But when that wasn't there, I was left with no other choice but to click the reasonable next best thing, which was battery preferences. And here I saw it wasn't in the current power adapter tab. So I navigated to the very nearby battery tab. And I saw that it wasn't here either. So with nowhere else left to turn, I went to the mother of all settings, which is system preferences. And here I scanned the icons multiple times where I wasn't able to find a match for me. So that left me with no choice but to actually read the icon labels, where I finally found the dock and menu bar as being a likely match for me. And in this section, I couldn't find the battery percentage in the current tab. So I had to keep scrolling through the tabs to at last arrive at the battery tab, where I could finally click show percentage. I experienced continuity friction in this interaction because what I believed would be a very quick and reasonable pause in my workflow ended up ballooning into a burdensome minutes-long detour that ended up interrupting my work. This experience of continuity friction can be examined through several design fundamentals, but we'll first start with a design heuristic. Good information architecture improves findability and discoverability. And information architecture is a decisive factor in whether or not you're able to easily navigate a system and accomplish your goals successfully. Good information architecture comes from leveraging innate mental models. And each of our mental models are comprised of the experiences that we've had in the past, the beliefs that we hold as human beings, the assumptions that we come up with, and the perceptions that we have. While we all have varying beliefs and experiences, the differences and variances in these beliefs and experiences can be normalized by conventions, which I'll touch on in a later example. Leaning into users' mental models lends for a system that feels logical, that feels intuitive, and it feels natural, because You're drawing from a pre-existing bank of knowledge. In the context of my continuity friction with macOS, because my prior experience of displaying the battery percentage required that I click the battery icon and click show percentage, the mental model that I now have to display the battery percentage is to replicate the same steps that I took in the previous OS in the new OS. Aside from the information architecture issues, the design heuristic, symbols and images should be used to convey meaning faster than text when appropriate is also at play. We use images to convey function because we process images much faster than we can for text. And because of that, we often rely on images over text to understand the relationships that exist between elements or what's happening or even where to go from there. In this case of continuity friction, I wasn't able to recognize the dock and menu bar icon as being relevant to my goal because if you look closely, only the dock is shown in the icon and not the menu bar. So that then communicates to me that this category only relates to the dock and not the menu bar. So I conclude that this icon isn't what I'm looking for, even when it is. Because we rely so heavily on our visual system to make connections, it's critical to provide accurate visuals so that we walk away with accurate conclusions. Since my visual scans of the system preferences icons couldn't recognize the dock and menu bar icon as being relevant to my goal, I had no choice but to resort to actually reading the icon labels. And that is a direct break from the design heuristic, minimize the need for unnecessary reading. This is because aside from reading the things that we want to read, we don't actually read. We will skim and scan material to quickly understand what we're looking at. We search for words that seem like what we're looking for rather than exactly what we're looking for. And that's all to say, if we can avoid reading, we will. While we do have a natural ability from our ancestors to learn spoken languages, reading and writing is still a relatively recent invention that was born just several thousand years ago. And it didn't become common until only a couple hundred years ago. So because of its alien nature, reading is a skill that not only has to be learned, but it also has to be practiced. Comparatively speaking, reading can be considered as artificial a skill as playing the piano. So back to the continuity friction. Because my multiple visual scans of the icons in system preferences couldn't return a match for me, I was forced to engage in the very cognitively taxing task of focused reading to finally discover that the dock and the menu bar section would ultimately lead me to finally being able to display the battery percentage on my computer. And all these factors come together to create continuity friction and turn what I believe would be a very brief and reasonable action and pause into a whole user journey that ended up interrupting my work and created anxiety for me as a user. Another occasion in which I experienced continuity friction is when I was adjusting the drawing guides of my artboard on Procreate. So before starting on my workflow, I wanted to make some adjustments to the drawing guides, and I was able to make all the changes I wanted to make, save for one, which was changing the color of the drawing guides. So thinking I maybe missed it somehow, I went back to the bottom of the screen where the tabs are, and when I searched there and I couldn't find the ability to change the color, I had no other choice but to actually just search on Google, where it was revealed to me that the rainbow strip that you see at the top of the screen there is actually a slider bar. So again, what I intended to be a very quick settings adjustment before I started on my project, it wound up taking me even more time than I thought it would. And it even mentally removed me from my flow by making me switch from my creative project and generation of ideas mindset on Procreate to my searching on Google and hunting and scanning for information mindset, which also deterred my productivity. So in case it still wasn't clear, here's an arrow pointing at the slider thumb for the slider bar. It is there, I promise you, you just can't see it. So the continuity friction that I experienced from trying to customize the drawing guides on Procreate can be traced to insufficient signifiers. The design heuristic provide appropriate and perceivable signifiers to communicate affordances. That ensures discoverability and it promotes understanding for users. Signifiers highlight relevant and useful affordances, which are the relationships that exist between elements and the possible actions that you can take from these relationships. Our ability to recognize and comprehend these online relationships actually stem from our relationships with objects in the physical world. In the physical world, objects provide visual cues like shape and color and texture to convey their signifiers. So for example, a smooth cup with a handle suggests to you then that it should be held by curling your fingers around the handle and lifting the cup to your mouth to drink from it. Conversely, a cup with no handle, but a faceted surface suggests to you that maybe you should grab the entire cup with your hand while gripping onto the facets with your fingertips for more security while you drink from it. So that, alongside other experiences that we've had and patterns that we've come across, form our expectations on how to engage with objects. And we carry this knowledge over from the physical world into the digital world. And the visual cues that we perceive in the interface then help us to understand how to navigate the system. For a signifier to be successful, it isn't enough that it exists. It also has to be appropriate and perceivable. And perceivability can be established by using sufficient visual cues that are obvious and clear. So that includes things like contrast and size and color. Appropriateness, on the other hand, can be established by using familiar and logical symbols or any kind of indicator that has meaning for users. In the case of Procreate, while the signifier is appropriate, it's a slider thumb for a slider bar, it can't be perceived. And because it can't be perceived, it ends up going unnoticed by me as a user and contributes to the continuity friction that I experienced. When more resources are required to achieve the desired result, this is known as inefficiency, or for our purposes, efficiency friction. Efficiency friction creates distance between you and your goals, and it prevents true productivity from happening. I experienced efficiency friction when I updated the Chrome app on my phone, which ended up removing the ability to open a link in a new tab, and it forces you instead to open a link in a group. The update also changed the tab layout from being a deck to a nested grid, which makes searching for a tab highly time-consuming and frustrating, and most importantly, inefficient. This efficiency friction with Chrome can be explained through the design heuristic support recognition over recall. Previously, all I had to do to get to a tab I wanted was scroll the deck, recognize the tab that I wanted, and then tap to go there. In the updated Chrome, I have to first recall where exactly the tab is located. Then I have to scroll to get there. I have to then tap the group that this tab is located in. And then in this group, I have to tap the tab. And in the case that I incorrectly recalled where it was, I have to then repeat steps 1 through 4 until I get it right. So that takes more time. Previously, it would take mere seconds to get to a tab you wanted. Now it can take even up to a minute. It also increases the interaction cost because more taps and mental resources are required. It also creates anxiety because of the extra efforts that are involved and required of you. The anxiety and the increase in time and resources are due to the fact that it's easier to recognize something than it is to recall. Recognition is cognitively easier than recall because it involves more cues. Recognizing information as being familiar involves cues triggering the activation of a memory chunk in your brain. So the more cues that you have available to you, the easier it'll be for you to recognize, which also makes recognition the faster process. On the other hand, reliably being able to recall information from memory, that requires sufficient practice, it requires recency of usage, and it requires strong contextual associations. And it's because of this fact that recall is error prone. It's difficult to perform. It's much slower to execute, and it's much more cognitively strenuous than recognition is. Alongside the heuristics support recognition over recall, the design heuristic that designs should be minimalist and task supporting can also be used to examine the efficiency friction that I experienced with Chrome. Keeping the attention of users focused allows for successful task completion without any distraction. It's critical for attention to be maintained because attention is a limited resource. And that means that we can only focus or divide our attention across a few tasks at a time. When attention strays, task abandonment or even getting lost can happen, which is what I experience sometimes when I navigate tabs on the updated Chrome app on my phone. If I can't recall where a specific tab is located, that means I have to check every group I have on my phone. And each group represents an opportunity for task abandonment. So despite starting off with my strongest intention to get the tab that I want to find, every group that I open and every tab that I come across is an opportunity for me to get distracted and reminded of other things that I had maybe bookmarked for later. And that further creates efficiency friction because it takes me away from my original task. And the anxiety I feel from drifting further and further away from my task, that decreases my cognitive capacity to successfully recall where the tab is located, which then creates even more anxiety and efficiency friction for me. As I previously stated, recall is error prone, and errors by nature are distracting and time consuming, both of which create inefficiency and block productivity from happening. Channeling users' attention and guarding them against any possible distraction ensures that users like myself can complete their tasks successfully. The final category of friction that I experienced is cognitive friction. And for our purposes, cognitive friction occurs when more attention is required to operate a system. I experienced cognitive friction when I was trying to add in a new account on 1Password. And as a mobile 1Password user, I didn't have any experience with the desktop interface. So when I found myself using the desktop interface and I was trying to add a new account, I searched the top of the screen for this option. And when I found that this option wasn't there, I searched the sides. And when this option wasn't there either, with nowhere else left to turn, I checked the bottom. And on the bottom, I did find a plus button that seemed to be what I was looking for, but I couldn't say with certainty that it was exactly what I was looking for. My uncertainty about whether or not the plus button was relevant to my goal and why I searched the top and the sides first can be considered through Jacob's law, which states that users spend most of their time on other sites. Because users spend most of their time on other sites, they prefer your site to work the same way as these other sites. Abiding by conventions, that eliminates the need for users to constantly learn a new pattern every time they use a new system. which is very time consuming for them and requires a lot of effort on their part. Instead, what they can do is simply leverage their previous experiences to quickly understand what to do, regardless of the interface or system that they come across. As per Jacob's law, it's convention to place controls at the top of the screen. And many interfaces keep with this convention, such as Google Docs, YouTube, Zoom, and many more. Because it's so widespread, many users, including myself, expect the controls to be located at the same place every time. But before becoming a widespread convention and part of Jacob's law, controls at the top of the screen were the result of another design heuristic. Incorporate familiar elements, processes, and language to create a logical and intuitive system. Controls at the top feel intuitive to us because human beings, we naturally associate top and primacy with importance. Top and primacy help to orient us and help us decide whether or not something is relevant to us. And this association can be observed in print, such as in newspapers, where the corresponding date can be found. In books, where the current chapter and section name can be found. When we navigate, we know to look up to find the street name or the exit name on the highway. In competitions, we attribute the first place as being the most important. And even in our language, we use the words first and top to signal importance. Because of how powerful this mental model and Jacob's law is, I repeatedly experience cognitive friction by searching for the new item control at the top of the screen every time I use the desktop interface for 1Password. And I have to relearn every time that it's actually at the bottom. Another aspect of cognitive friction came from the misuse of the design quality of proximity. And proximity states that elements that are close together are perceived as more related than elements that are further apart. And this occurs because our visual system, like that of other animals, makes sense of the world around us by creating structures and perceiving objects as a whole rather than as individual components. So it's why in each of these examples, we're able to see two different groups of items despite the very unique components that make up each group. Alongside proximity, the design quality of similarity also works to create the perception that the plus button isn't relevant to my goal because it shares the same styling as the very nearby edit button. The design quality similarity states that elements that have similar visual appearances are perceived as more related than visually dissimilar elements. In these examples, we can immediately understand the relationships that exist between these elements based on their visual appearances. In the case of 1Password, the proximity of the plus button and the edit button to the current Webflow tab that's open communicates to me that their functions are localized only to the Webflow tab. And that perception is further reinforced by how similar the stylings of these two buttons are. They're identical. And this association is so compelling and familiar to me as a user that it creates cognitive dissonance for me. And it requires mental resources on my part to problem solve and reason through this conflict that I'm experiencing. And all of this is experienced as cognitive friction, which demands effort from the user, and it prevents a seamless workflow from happening. So this now brings us to the consequences of frictions in the user interfaces. And consequences can be approached from both the concrete and speculative angle. So starting with the concrete, despite these frictions appearing confined to only the user and the interface, the consequences of negative user experiences are certain without a doubt. Friction reduces the relative value of the system for users, And reduced value causes users to consider competitors' offerings, which means a potential revenue loss for the company, especially today when users are living in an unprecedented era of choice. Reduced value also impacts brand value and hits customer loyalty, even more so if there were positive expectations from users for the product or service to begin with. It can also raise costs in two ways. One of them is by increasing support costs. The more users who can't resolve their frictions on their own, the more support expenses are then required to compensate for these frictions, such as hiring and training new support employees, as well as the equipment and compensation that they need. The other is through creating expensive rework for the teams involved for its development. Rework is the additional effort of redoing a process or an activity that was incorrectly done in the first place. So rework means time away from value-added work, like high priority, high impact new projects. This means that these initiatives, they don't get the full attention and the resources that they need. So their outcomes have no choice but to suffer. Revisiting already shipped projects, that also translates to a monetary loss alongside increased costs for the company, since the work that's been done previously has been invalidated and additional resources and time has to be allocated to make corrections for it in the present or in the future. Additionally, building on top of bad work also makes it even harder to do good work. As for the law of adjacency, mistakes create more mistakes. All in all, this points to, all in all, this points to rework being a highly expensive and costly cycle. Aside from the concrete consequences, there is the speculative consequence of opportunity cost. An opportunity cost is the loss of potential gain from other alternatives when one alternative is chosen. And opportunity costs can look very different. What it can look like is maybe on a smaller scale. It can be the loss of a lucrative deal from maybe an executive who was tasked with finding a system that would be implemented company-wide. But after experiencing frictions with their product, they decide to go with a competitor. On a larger scale, it can be the lost momentum on a promising high-impact project that had the potential to take your product to a new market, but it ended up getting sidetracked from having to do rework. It really is impossible to gauge how many failed companies of the past could have been today's industry giants if it weren't for their interface frictions. Evidently, there are considerable concrete and speculative consequences of interface friction. Abiding by design fundamentals from the start to create a frictionless user experience, that doesn't give your users a reason to leave. And maybe they can even potentially promote your product, which can lead to greater growth and revenue for you. It also prevents companies from engaging in expensive rework and then having to increase support costs. A usable and high quality product keeps teams and resources moving forwards, which serves as efforts towards minimizing opportunity costs. I mentioned this previously, but design fundamentals are critical to the development of productive user experiences. And these are the systems in which all of us as users feel that our goals are the most supported and empowered by the technology that we use and surround ourselves by. So thank you guys. Again, my name is Grace Kim, and if you'd like to learn more about the frictions that I discussed today, you can check out my website at grace-kim.design, where I go much more in depth on these examples. I'm also open to opportunities, so feel free to reach out via email at grace.sbkim@gmail.com about that. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Really interesting, really nicely done, Grace. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, you touched on a bunch of fantastic topics. So, hey, if folks want to turn their cameras on, if you'd like to ask a question or a comment, I'd love to share. The floor is open. So Carl asks, regarding icon usage, isn't there a careful balance to be struck between cognition of icons versus simple text labels, especially if there are many icons where there may not be near universal idioms?
Right. And I think that's a great point. I'm glad that you mentioned that because obviously from our mental models, we do have a collective understanding of what certain icons mean. Like, for example, we know an icon that looks like a house. That means home to all of us, which kind of serves as a way to get back to that central, to the meat of the software or whatever it may be. So these icons like the home icon and maybe the magnifying icon to mean search, this is all part of our collective vocabulary. But there is research that shows that our icon usage isn't limited to our collective vocabulary that's already been established. And we see that if you're going to introduce a new icon, you're absolutely allowed to. It's just that in the best interest of the users and the company, having a label that clearly accompanies and elaborates on what this icon means that's unfamiliar for users really helps to iron out those kinks. So that's where we see icon labels being critical to the understanding of new icons. So maybe, of course, having icon labels for familiar iconography like the home and search, that may be, it's always a nice to have, right? Just to, maybe your grandmother or your grandfather, they just got their new smartphone and they're really excited about it, but these icons, they're kind of lost on what they mean. That always helps new users, and maybe it does not hurt to have them. But for new icons, definitely, it's a really, really big help in helping users understand what this is for and how I use it.
There were a couple comments early on in the talk where a couple of us were noticing that in one of the first, I think it was the first screen, there was like some real accessibility issues with the header overlaid. It was like a really thin, light white font over a textured background. It's like, that's not going to pass contrast.
Right. Yeah.
Oh,
and it's especially alarming because it's a TV. And most people have TVs, and there aren't any, this is really an area where we shouldn't be discriminating against any kind of usage or ability here. It really should be accessible to everybody. And that starts with those details, right? The icon labels, the text that you use, the typography, everything.
Yep. Especially when it's sitting 5 to 10 feet away from it as well. So
right. Yeah, that's no excuse. It's no excuse to say most people sit 5 feet away. Yeah. Well, what if I'm in the kitchen? What if I'm just peeking my head out?
Yeah, or just old eyes. Any other questions or comments for Grace you'd like to share? And everyone should be able to turn their mics on and their cameras if you would like to ask your question yourself. Feel free to.
Hey, Grace, I had a quick question for you. It seemed like some of the examples you gave, some of the friction you encountered was a result of it being kind of a recent redesign. So things you were used to being where they weren't there anymore. And I'm just wondering what we can do, like we're doing some redesign work around some of our products. What can we do to help our customers find stuff when things have had to be moved? Maybe there's a new platform being used, or just there's some general design changes.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't think there's a one size fits all answer to that question, because all products are different. All the use cases are different. Maybe you have, there's obviously maybe an office worker who uses their product in optimal conditions, right? Adequate lighting, connection, etc. And in that case, maybe a way to notify users is by maybe having like tooltips, if that works for you, and maybe through testing you found that users have been really responsive, and integrating that tooltip has been really eliminated those support requests that you see from users. But there's also the flip side of products that are used in extreme scenarios, like maybe there are scuba divers who are gone for moments at a time and there's no connectivity to be found anywhere, and that really resolving for introducing a frictionless redesign that really comes from evaluating how your products are being used in the first place. And I think as an organization that really needs heads down work and really evaluating what are the constraints that we're working around here, what are the use cases that we're specifically trying to work around here. And I think through doing that research, that deep thinking, it should be able to point you towards how to as frictionlessly as possible introduce a redesign.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. Thanks for asking.
Excellent. Thanks for joining us, Joshua. One more question. Does anybody have another question for Grace before we wrap up?
I have a question.
Great,
I
great.
wanted to ask how you keep all these principles in mind as you design. Like, do you kind of consciously think about these as you design, or is it more subconscious? How do you keep all of these principles in mind?
That's a great question, because I think as designers, design fundamentals kind of remains an abstract concept for us, and it's difficult to see the practical applications of them, which is exactly why I wanted to create this presentation, to provide concrete examples of these design fundamentals in action and their applications. So I think one way to really keep them in mind is by considering whatever you're designing through the eyes of a user, and maybe keeping that use case in mind. Again, if this user is trying to accomplish X, consider everything that they need to accomplish X, whether that means high visibility of a certain function or a button. That then ties into maybe if that ties into another heuristic, but maybe if this is a really critical input section and it has to go right, making sure that error notices are immediately obvious and not out of the way where they have to look for it. That saves them time. So again, keeping that use case in mind, seeing things, and really that requires practice, being able to consider things from the eyes of a user, because as designers, we get so attached and almost blind to the work that we're doing. We become so accustomed to them that I think stepping into those shoes and eyes of a user helps to lend you that perspective that that maybe we're not seeing, and really help design fundamentals shine in that way.
Great answer. And I'll add, it's certainly something you internalize over time, but if it's something that is new for you, there's websites. I put one in chat. There's even like fun playing cards. There's all kinds of ways to, either while you're designing or maybe when you're reviewing a design you did, is a great time to stop and say, hey, I should think about some of these. Best the same way we think about accessibility. Have I captured all the things that I should do in this interface for that? So
Yeah.
This is great. Yep. Any other questions for Grace? Last call. Okay. Grace, thank you so much for sharing your work with us tonight. We really appreciate it. It was great. Really, really interesting. And I love the way that you wove, heuristics, best practices, cognitive science all together. Really nicely done. And thank you everybody for joining us. I'm glad you could make it to this month's event. As always, you can visit us on novaux.com outskools.com to see upcoming events. Next month's will be a talk from the folks at OutSchool. Be sure to register on Zoom so you get the meeting details. If you are interested in giving a talk or a workshop, organizing a panel discussion, we would love to talk to you. Reach out to us through Meetup, and you can get a hold of me on LinkedIn and Twitter and pretty much all the networks. And we would love to hear from you. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Grace.
Thank you
and we
again
hope,
for having me. And thank you guys for being here.
Of course. And we hope to see everybody at a coming meetup. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a good evening, everybody.
Okay.
Thanks, Grace.
Thanks, Jim.